Hi, welcome back. In the last part we finished off by exporting the textures from Mari out. So in our case we've exported 3 images for the bump, 3 for the spec and 3 for the colour, so we end up with 9 texture files in total. And I think I just want to point out that before we continue and we go into Maya and do some renders, I also created some different variations of skin colour for this guy by really just going into the base tone here, popping open the HSV node, changing the base tone, and then maybe coming in, changing the secondary tone as well, again just with that HSV node we've had on there, just to create some various different skin colors. This will allow me to do a render with various skin tones on, so I can pick the best for my needs, but it also demonstrates what a fantastic flexible system this is with these adjustment stacks on all these individual layers. We've got a lot of control, everything from eye color to skin color, so you come in and change the color of the eyes if you wanted to, to match a varying different skin tone. So really with Mari that becomes a very simple process to get a few different variations of texture out. And if I open up Maya here, you can see I've got my plane model, but I've popped open a render view, and here's Burr in green. Basically this is the first color we exported out of Mari. This is the color I exported out in the last part. So you may notice we've got a very nice subsurface scattering material on here, and we've got some nice eye detail, all of which I'll be getting into. But here he is again in blue, and here he is again in red, green and blue. So it just gives us a look at what he would look like in various different shades. And also, change the facial expression of the model slightly, and all of a sudden you've got 3 separate dinosaurs in 3 separate colors. So, very, very easy to change control of your texture there. Alright, but before we go any further, we need to look at this. Now, I exported this with a smooth node on, which we no longer need. So if we click the mesh and go to the channel box, you'll see I've got a polysmooth face on. Just change the divisions to 0. Now you may or may not have that problem. I shouldn't have saved the file with a smooth on, but it really is no big deal. Turn it off and then delete the history. Okay, easy enough. Now, we've got one other problem. This is all one combined mesh at the moment, which means any shader I use for the skin, say a subsurface scattering material, will also end up, say, on the teeth, and we might not want that. So I'm going to break this model back down into its component parts. So I'm just going to go up to Mesh, Separate. Okay, and that will separate the mesh into its component parts. From there I'm going to delete the history on all of these component parts. Okay, you should see that empty transform node that was there has now disappeared. And now I'm going to do some organization. I'm going to start by selecting the main skin, which is currently called Polysurface 3, and I'm going to change that to main body. Whoops, if I can spell. Just so I know what's going on. Then I'm going to hide it, Control H, and then I'm going to start to group some similar objects together. So all of these spikes, for instance, can Control G, we can group those and just call that spikes. And I'm going to get the whole mouth in one go because it will all be textured with the same material for now. Control G, mouth, and this just leaves us with the eye left and eye right. So let's move all of these out of the group there, and I'm just middle mouse dragging. Come on, out you get. There we go, and now I can delete this empty group. Okay, so one other thing, when we took this Bert chap into Mari, we left behind his little eye lens caps here. Now we did that because they're just going to be a glossy transparent material, so really there is no need to texture them, so we left them in Maya and didn't take them into Mari. And I'm just going to center the pivot on this guy and move it back into place. There we go. Just want to get the eyeballs moved back into place. They might have moved around a little bit. We can always look at that later. It's not really so important for right now, but there we go. Now I'm going to unhide the main body, and now we can get on with putting a texture on this guy. Now for this I'm going to hit 3 to smooth. In fact, I'm going to select everything and smooth everything. because I want it smoothed out here for when I render it. So before we go any further, I'm going to use a subsurface scattering material for this, and I'm going to use the new Mila layered material. It's got a really nice subsurface scattering, but you know, if we look at our UV map, as you'll be used to seeing it by now, we've got these 3 patches. So we've got 1, 2 and 3. So if I select the whole thing, then obviously they'll all be full. Okay, so we've got the 3 patches. Now that would mean 3 textures, which when we export it out of Mari, you'll note we have 3 color, 3 spec and 3 bump. So let's just stick a straight lambda on this for now so we can have a look at how that all works. So I'm just going to assign new material, and I'll just stick a straight lambda on there. Now I'm going to assign a file texture to the color. So just file, and you'll notice that I've got various colors here, blue, red and our initial color. So it's important to open up the first one, so 0, 1, and then we have 0, 2 and 0, 3 from Mari, and you won't notice anything in the viewport, or if you do, it'll be seriously wonky. I mean, that is not what we painted in Mari. So UV tiling mode, you'll see now, is new for Maya 2015-16, and this does ZBrush, Mudbox, and in our case, Mari. Now it'll say it's found 3 tiles, but you still won't see anything, so hit Generate Preview. And give it a little time to update in the viewport, and you'll see our texture comes back. Okay, we haven't got the eyes yet, we'll have to do those separately of course, and we haven't got the spikes and the horns, but we're on with the main body. So now we've got, you know, a look at how all 3 textures combine onto one mesh. I just want to set up a basic lighting scenario. So I'm going to start off with a floor plane, like so, and then I'm going to bring in a directional light, and I'm just going to get this so he's standing on it. Okay, now I'm going to bring in a directional light, so I'm just going to go up to Create Lights, Directional Light, and I'll make this a little bigger. Now the scaling of a directional light has no bearing on its intensity, so scaling it up or down isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. Neither will moving it. It's all about the angle with the directional light. The only reason that I'm moving this around is just so I can get it out my way. I'd get exactly the same render if the light was here or here. However, I would get different renders based upon the angle. So you can think of this as kind of an infinite sunlight. So I'm just going to cue this at an angle for now. And I'll probably make it a bit smaller just so it doesn't take up so much room. Again, it will have no bearing on the end result of the light. Okay, and another thing, so now we've got one basic light and we've got a floor to receive some shadows, but more importantly we've got a floor to bounce some light up of, because when the light hits this we'll be using global illumination, so we want light to bounce off the floor. Okay, so right now if we hit render, this is not going to look very good at all. Remember, we're aiming for this, and I'll just show you what we're going to get. Okay, so that finished rendering, and this is what we get. It's obviously not very impressive at all. So first things first, we need to start bouncing some light around this scene, because with one light source we're never going to do this with direct illumination. However, this quick render has shown us that our texture is working on all 3 patches. We're seeing complete coverage of the whole body where we've applied the material to. So that's one thing out the way at least. Now let's take a look at some lighting. So we're going to use a fairly simple setup, the first part of which being, now obviously we're using mental ray. If we take a look under our quality settings, they've got an overall quality setting of 0.75. I'm going to put that down to 0.25. We're doing here are some test renders, so we don't really want the quality cranked up, and I can put the lighting quality down to say 0.8. Now I can use the new GI prototype from Maya, but it is only in 2016 at the moment, and it's also a prototype, so I'm going to go with a more tried and tested final gather method. So once I've turned this on, I'll need to go down to legacy options and take a look at some of the final gather settings. Now by default they've decided to give this quite a high value, so we're going to knock that from 200 to 30, the point density to 0.2 or 0.3. The higher this is, the better the quality, the longer the render. The same goes for accuracy. Secondary diffuse bounces. How many times do we want the light to bounce? Well, in this case twice should be enough for a test. Now we'll go down to final gather quality. Because we're using very low quality, we're going to turn the filtering on, which will stop any bright spots from developing. And under tracing, I'm going to give myself a nice amount of reflections and refractions, and I'm also going to go to a max trace depth of 10. Now this is a little bit overkill at the moment, but if I go for more bounces later on, then this will need to be at, if I say you wanted 5 bounces, this would need to be 5, 5 and 10. So I'm going to set it there now so I can play around with this later and not worry about it. It really won't up render time that much on this. In fact, with these changes, we're turning on the final gather, we're turning off the GI prototype and going to final gather, putting this quality setting down a bit, putting this quality setting down a bit, and adjusting the final gather settings to this. I'd be willing to bet that our previous render at 2 minutes and 14 seconds, even with bounce light and GI, is actually a lot faster. So let's have a look. Okay, so now we're bouncing some light around. When I flick between them, you'll see we get light bounce up on the belly and up on the face. So that's helping us out a little bit. Just bouncing some light around the scene is making a bit of a difference. It's definitely lightening up our image. And we've gone from a render time of 2 minutes and 14 seconds to 10 seconds, which for test rendering is a bit of an improvement, really. So now we've got this done, but we're still not getting enough light. It still looks, you know, like we should introduce more directional lights, more area lights, more spotlights, try and light the sky up. However, as we have shiny skin and we're going to have a shiny eye, anything that's shiny needs an environment to reflect off. And the final gather rays need something to bounce off. And so there's many different ways of doing this. In this case, I'm going to use a IBL, an image-based lighting node. So if we go up to the settings and under scene, you'll see here image-based lighting. So we'll go create, and you'll notice that this yellow has appeared in the background. That's actually a big yellow sphere that will contain our image-based lighting. Now you can rescale the big yellow sphere, but while this infinite is on, it's pointless. This is an infinite sphere now, which is how we want it set. So really the only time I would scale this while this was on infinite is if I was having trouble seeing it. So sometimes if it's scaled out too large, you can't actually see the picture on it, it's too far away, in which case I'd scale it in, but it will make no difference to the lighting at this particular moment in time. So let's select a HDR image. And I've got one in here, it's just basically a field. It's nothing special, we just need something to provide an environment, to provide some reflections for us. So as you can see, it's nothing spectacular, it's just basically a field. Okay, so I'm going to use this one, it'll be adequate to my needs, because in the final shot you'll notice that, actually just pop open the render view, I'm actually blocking the background with my own background, which is more cartoony. I'm really just using this for the reflections on the specular highlights and whatnot. So now let's pop this open and go to our 10-second render. Let's kidnap this one and hit render again and see what introducing that IBL does for us. Okay, now we are cooking on gas. This is much better than the previous shot. Already we're starting to introduce quite a significant amount of light in here. It's almost enough for our intents and purpose, and our render time has gone up to 16 seconds. The problem is this does not look like skin. If I go back here, this has kind of a glow about it. It's almost translucent towards the edges here, and this is a subsurface scattering material. So we're going to need to introduce one of those. Now there are a few in Maya. There's a fast scattering for a skin. There's a second version of that node that was introduced in Maya 2014, I think. And right now in Maya 2015 and 2016, there's something called the Mila material, which is Mental Ray's new layering material. It's superb. It's long before time that we had one. So because it's new and you might not have seen it used so much, I'm going to actually use that. So I'm going to select our main character here. And there we go. Just took a while for some reason. And I'm going to assign a new material to it. Now, if I go under Mental Ray materials, you'll see here I've got this Mila material with lots of little shader balls on it, denoting that it's a layered material. So let's flick that on and let's have a look at it. Now, if you're used to the architectural material, you'll be used to all the controls for reflection, refraction, and all of that stuff being all in one kind of giant material. Mila material is slightly different. You start with a base component and then you add layers to it. So you can add a weighted layer, which is just a layer over the top, a Fresnel layer, which would be something with a Fresnel reflection or a custom reflection layer, basically. We're not going to delve into every aspect of this material, just enough to get some subsurface scattering on our skin. So we've got a diffuse base component color. So let's take this color. And in fact, in this case, this color's not going to make much of a difference to us because we're going to add a layer over the top anyway. So right now I'm going to add a weighted layer over the top, and I'm going to go with a subsurface scattering layer to start off with. So I'm going to hit scatter, and you'll see that this is now added a subsurface scatter to our base material. So in this way we can just add layer on the top of each other, we can mix layers together. It's an extremely versatile material. Okay, but let's look at this for a start. So here we've got front tint. Now in the front tint will go our main color file. So let's select our, let's say our green color, the one we initially made. And I'll need to then turn on the tiling for Mari, same as we did with the other material, and hit generate preview. Now you don't have to hit generate preview. When you render, if you haven't, you'll still render correctly. You just won't see it in the viewport. And in fact, because this is on a subsurface scattering layer, that's not showing me that in the viewport. Now I could go and put that on the base layer if I wanted to see it on the viewport. So I'm just going to open up the hypershade and I'm going to find that texture. This will just save me from having too many textures. So this should be the texture we need. Indeed it is. It's the burnt color. So let's go back to the Mila material attributes, and let's just middle mouse drag this up to color. Now I'm going to click on this. It takes it a second to update in the viewport with these three materials, and if I need to I can now click here and click generate preview, but I don't need to. Okay, so technically there was no need to put this base component in because this one has a weight of 1, which means it totally supersedes it. But as we want to see what we're doing in the viewport too, putting this in just allows that texture to be generated in the viewport. Okay, so now we have subsurface scattering, and without changing anything at all, let's just do a quick render. So I'll bookmark this one and hit render. Now this will take a bit longer because the subsurface scattering material takes a bit longer to render, but you should be aiming for maybe 40-45 seconds about now. Okay, well that actually only took 18 seconds, so it's actually faster than I thought it would be. Another thing about this material, it's quite speedy. In comparison to the old subsurface shader, but there's a complete lack of definition going on here. And in fact, if I just break the connection with the front tint and put the front tint back to white, it might be easier to see what's going on without the tint. Okay, so without the tint, you see a lack of definition. I've lost the nostrils. I mean, I've lost pretty much all of the detail. This is because my scale is not high enough. So if we go down to scale conversion and set that up to, well, let's try 20 to start with. What we're trying to do is get some more detail back in. Now I'm really starting to see that detail come back in, and I'm really starting to see where my subsurface scattering is having an effect. So at the moment we're bleeding through red because it's set up for skin by default, and we've got sort of a green dinosaur, so that's probably not going to be the best choice. But let's just set our scale conversion up to 40, and this will really show off the subsurface scattering that's happening here. So I'm going to kidnap this one, just hit the save image and re-render. And now you can see we've got a lot more of the definition back, but we've lost a bit of the SSS. We've lost a bit of the scatter coming through. So this was a determination on how much you need. You can see we've still got scatter coming through the arms here, but I want an exaggerated effect. So I'm going to go for a happy middle ground. We tried 20, which is this. With this, I actually didn't save the first one, but the first one was just pure kind of white. So this is 20 and this is 40. So maybe a bit less scatter and a bit more definition is required. So I think I'll go to 25. Can always experiment later. Like I said, the material is quick enough that we're getting 18-second renders, which leaves us a lot of leeway for fine tuning. Now the problem is this is red coming through here, and I want green, because I've got a predominantly green dinosaur. Most of his body is in green. Now if we take a look at the front scatter radius, this is red, green and blue. So at the moment this is letting a lot of red light through, some green light and almost no blue. So I want to switch this around. I want to make this 20 to let a bit of red light through, sorry, this 10 to let a bit of red light through, and this 20 to let more green light through. I'm going to do front and the back. So now this should skew towards green instead of being red, which would be more human skin tone. And you can see as the render starts to come in, you can see these bright areas of green. So now my subsurface scattering is letting more green light through and less red. So because, as I say, the skin on this is predominantly green, that's what I'm looking for. If you've got your dinosaur in blue or red or purple or pink, then you may need to play with this. Just remember red, green and blue, and the higher the value, the more of that color light is going to come through. So now I've got the basic subsurface scattering to where I want it. I can now put the front tint back on. So let's come in here and open up the hypershade, grab my file texture, which is my color, and drag it in, middle mouse drag it into front tint. Now I'm going to hit render again. Okay, and apologies folks, but I've dragged that into back tint instead of front tint because I'm having one of those days. So into front tint, not back tint. My apologies. So let's have a look that this actually went into the front tint now. So I'm just clicking here to bring open the texture. Okay. And let's just break the connection on this. My apologies. This material is a bit new, so it does have the odd occasional hiccup. But this one was probably me as I connected it to the wrong tint. So okay, so that should be fine. Let me just middle mouse drag that again. Apologies for this folks. Sometimes the simplest things. There we go, and let's do another render. Okay, so our render time has increased ever so slightly. We've gone up to 19 seconds, but we've got a very nice tint. We've got a very nice subsurface scatter on this. You can see that it's coming through the arms quite nicely. The problem is everything looks a bit too subsurface scattered. Now, back in the olden days, we'd play around with the radiuses and try and get this perfect with a subsurface scattering material, but because we're dealing with a layered material, we can simply put the weight of this down to 0.5, so we'll half subsurface scattering, and we can add another layer, so a weighted layer, diffuse reflection, which in this case is just diffuse basically, and this time we can then put this on top. So if we make this say a weight of 0.52, then 0.5 and 0.5 will add up to 1, and if I just leave this at a grey colour, you'll see this go half grey and half subsurface scattering. Okay, there we go. So there's a half grey over the subsurface scattering, which turns the subsurface scattering down a bit while still allowing it to be active. Now, this is not perfect, of course, because we don't want grey. So we're going to drop a texture here in the colour channel. So I'm just going to add a new texture because I'm going to tweak this one slightly, and this texture will be our colour again. So just the colour we exported out, and UV tiling mode Mari, and generate preview, and that should now display in the viewport, although as I say, this material hasn't been the most reliable for me in the viewport, and it's still generating that preview. So just give it a second, and there we go. Alright, so that's nicely in the viewport. So if we look at the material, we've now got a 50% diffuse layer and a 50% subsurface scattering layer. So let's render that and see what we get. Okay, now we're looking much more like skin. Now I just want to lighten up this diffuse layer a bit to create a bit less saturation. So let's go into the diffuse layer, into the color, and into the file node itself. And if we look at color balance, I'm going to take up the color gain, and that would make it darker. So I'm going to use the color offset just to make it a bit lighter. Okay, now I'm going to kidnap and re-render just so you can see the difference, and the change should be fairly subtle. Normally I would do this in Photoshop, so I would have a brighter skin layer for the subsurface scattering than I would for the dinosaur, and I've actually gone a little bit too far with that. So let me just tweak that down a bit. I just wanted to take a little bit of saturation away. It's not even really necessary. It's also fairly simple to do this afterwards in post. Let's just take that down just a little bit. There we go. Just a tiny bit lighter between the two. Okay, so the difference is quite subtle. It's just knocked some of the brightest green saturation out. And I'd say it's not really a necessary step. It's something I like to do when I'm playing with this subsurface scattering material. Okay, so we've still got a ways to go. We've got no eyes, and we've got no bump, and we've got no speck. So let's sort out some reflectivity on this guy. Now, at the moment, we've got this diffuse reflection, which is just the reflection from the diffuse color. We've got a scatter, and now we need some sort of reflective component. So let's go with a glossy reflection. Now, we're going to turn the roughness down to about 0.3. Now the roughness, if we've got no roughness, it will be a very mirror finish. If we've got tons of roughness, it'll be more of a frosted finish. So we want quite a mirrory finish on this, so about 0.3. Now the color, we will use our spec map for. So let's go here and load in our spec map. Let's go to the top, grab the spec map, and there we go. Now I've got to turn the tiling mode onto Mari once again, but I don't need to generate a preview. So let's see. Okay, that should have found some patches. Okay, and again we have a little problem. I'll just click off the material and back on it. So I'm just clicking the background at the moment, and it seems that Maya is doing some searching, so it will take it at 2 seconds or so. It normally doesn't take this long. Okay, so it's just throwing a small fit, but it feels like it's now found all 3 tiles. So you'll see here 3 tiles found, and I've lost my viewport again, which happens a bit. I can simply go back into the diffuse reflection and hit generate preview, and that should update the viewport once again. So there we go. So again, a few little problems with this material still, but it is relatively new, so you know you're gonna have to forgive some problems. I really have anything seriously wrong. Just occasionally you might need to regenerate the preview, and occasionally it takes the material a little while to update. Okay, so Let's have a look at the weight here. Now at the moment we can see in our sample the weight is now 100% glossy reflection, which means this guy will just look like a mirror. So let's put the weight down. We want this to act as some specular highlights along the skin. We don't want it to turn into a chrome ball. So now you can see I've got a nice sharp specular highlight. Let's give him a render and see what he looks like. So there we go, that definitely brought in our reflectivity. We've got some nice sharp points of specularity at the moment. Now, to be honest, this is not perfect, obviously. It's far too bright, even at 0.1, but I'm not going to worry about that for the moment. I want to get some bump on here before we start doing anything else. Now, you would think you could just open the bump from here, but that won't work. At the moment, this won't connect it to a bump node. It'll just put a picture in here and nothing will happen. So I'm going to pop open the hypershade and I'm going to build my own bump node to go in here. So I'm going to get my hypershade out a bit bigger so I can just see my working area. And I'm going to go up to utilities and I'm going to take a bump 2D. Okay. There we go. Alright, so that's just opened up in the wrong place. So let's have a look what we've got here. And I'm just going to clear the work area off altogether so we can see what's going on. I've just got to clear graph and a bump 3D node, which is exactly what I didn't want, and a bump 2D. So just create a bump 2D node. And you'll see it here in the main work area, and then I want a 2D texture and I want a file node, which will come with a UV placement node, and into this file node I'm going to load the bump images. So come down to bump, there we go, and it's Mari, of course, so UDM Mari. It's found 3 tiles. I don't need a viewport preview, so I'm just going to drag the out alpha into the bump value. Okay, now I've got a bump node that I can start putting into my mila material. So click my mila material up here, and I'm going to want to bump, first of all, that specularity, and I'm also going to want to bump the diffuse reflection. Okay, so let's see what we get now. And let me just bring up the render view, and I'll save this one, and you should start to see some bump come on here. Okay, and what I'm seeing is absolutely no bump, so let's go and find out why. Now we've got the out alpha plugged into the bump value, which means the texture will have to have alpha as luminance armed. So let's click our texture here, and as you can see, alpha as luminance is unticked. So make sure under your file texture, which in our case is the bump, tick alpha as luminance, and now when I re-render you'll see some bump. You'll also see much too high a value bump, I would have thought, but we can tone that down in a second. Okay, so as you can see, definitely have bump, but if you render with that bump for the first time and you're not getting anything, make sure that alpha as luminance is checked under your file texture node for the bump. Now if you want to turn the bump down, come in and click the bump 2D node and come up here and just turn that from 1 to 0.1. We can try for a start. Now if you want to find that without using the hypershade, you can just of course click material attributes here, and then under the bump, if you click on the little icon to the left, you should see a bump depth value. In this case it should be 0.1. So let's go back to the material and check this one. Now they're the same bump nodes, so they should actually be linked. We use the same node for both. So that should be 0.1 as well. I'm not quite sure why they didn't save in the hypershade. I probably forgot to press return. But let's take a look at this with 0.1 bump on it. Okay, so that's definitely given us a better bump value. Now we've still got this problem with our gloss layer, but that's okay. We can turn that down in a second. There is one thing that is slightly concerning me. It's that our our subsurface scattering isn't quite popping enough. And if I go and look at our material, I've got a weight here of 0.1, which is dealing with all this specular. I've got a diffuse reflection of 0.5, and I've got a scatter of 0.5, which is probably allowing some of this diffuse base component to come through. So the bottom layer should be the scattering, and then these two should be over the top. However, for whatever reason, I've set the scatter into 0.5, so I'm going to set it to 1. That will make the base layer all scattering, and then this diffuse will sit over the top, and then this glossy will sit over the top of everything else. So let's just kidnap this image and do another quick render. Okay, now I'm getting the pop from the subsurface scattering that I'm looking for. In fact, if I flick backwards and forwards, I think you'll be able to tell. So all that had happened is I've accidentally at some point turned the scatter down to 0.5, and that's let a bit of this diffuse base component show through, which we don't want at all. So by setting the first layer to 1, that makes sure that this layer will always be visible under this one and this one. So I'm going to call this quits for this part, and I'll come back in the last part and we'll finish the shading of the skin, the teeth, the eyes, and we'll put a nice background on this so we can get sort of this cartoon effect render that I've got here. So I look forward to seeing you in the next part, and I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I'll be back in a moment. Thanks for watching.